Good afternoon, fathers. Good afternoon, seminarians. Good afternoon, my dear students. Good afternoon, my dear colleagues. In this course in philosophical theology, centering on the thought of Whitehead and Hartshorn, I know it has been quite some time since I last uploaded, and that's because my father passed away, and so many things came in between. Tuguegarao was hit by two calamities, both very high floods, and that is what explains why it has taken some time for me to get back into the grind of uploading. By the way, I'd like you to know that before I upload, even if I have dealt with this subject for a long time, I still have to prepare, because I would like my lectures, I'd like my sessions with you to be truly enriching, helpful, and backed up by solid research and study on these two great philosophers. I just like to make a remark about feedback that I once got. I was talking to some colleague who is a philosophy professor also, in fact, a well-known philosophy professor. And I told him that a friend of mine was doing his doctoral dissertation on Hartshorn. And he said, what a waste of time. It's something that leads to a dead end. In other words, his conception of the process thought of Whitehead and Hartshorn was such that, unlike phenomenology or hermeneutic philosophy or social theory, it seemed to lead to a dead end. But I would like to emphasize that misperception, what notwithstanding, there are very respectable philosophers who are engaged, thank you, Jap, who are engaged in the work of Whitehead and Hartshorn. Not too long ago, we talked about eternal objects. I emphasize that eternal objects are not actual occasions. They are not actual entities. So there is nowhere in the world that we will find eternal objects. Now, talking about eternal objects immediately brings to mind Plato's concept of the eidos. The soul, he taught, once beheld these perfect forms and is reminded of them when he sees the imperfect forms in this present terrestrial life. So there was some kind of an existence for these perfect forms, the eidos, and that is what justifies some philosophy professors and commentators in characterizing Plato as a hyper-realist, in contrast to Aristotle, who thought of these as abstractions. The ideal horse, for example, the ideal man, the ideal flower, the ideal musical theory, or the ideal musical piece. All of these, says Aristotle, are abstractions from the things that we actually experience on earth. And so, as abstractions, they are products of the mind. Now, the same question can and should be asked in regard to Whitehead's eternal objects, considering what crucial role they play in the constitution of actual occasions. So we ask the question, are these eternal objects produced by thought, or are they objective to thought? In other words, are they merely the result of thought operating, or do they possess some kind of objectivity? Although this early, we can exclude one particular kind of objectivity, which is the objectivity that we would attribute to actual occasions. Repeat, eternal objects are not actual occasions. So the kind of objectivity that actual entities or actual occasions enjoy is an objectivity that these eternal objects do not possess. Whitehead, like Plato, believes that they are objective to thought and that they are not merely products of thought. However, unlike Plato, the actuality of eternal objects is so only when they are actualized in the world, in actual occasions. Eternal objects, we said, are prehended in the self-causation of actual occasions. Let me explain that. When an actual occasion when an actual occasion constitutes itself, which is something made possible by the fact of ongoingness, the very dynamism that underlies all things. So when an actual entity becomes, or an actual occasion attains concrescence, it does so having prehended the actual occasions in its immediate past that now cease to exist, plus the eternal objects. Because if an actual occasion would prehend only the occasions in its immediate past, there would be no novelty. Plants would remain forever what they are. But the fact is that evolution, human and infrahuman, is very real. So plants evolve, animals evolve, and even the consciousness of the human person evolves, as does the body of the human person. So, if there is novelty in the world, and novelty need not always mean a change for the better, because we already remarked in the past that novelty, that dynamism, ongoingness, creativity is neutral in regard to beautiful and ugly, in regard to good and bad, in regard to pleasurable and unpleasurable. Okay. Whitehead is also known as a nominalist. Nominalist in the sense that eternal objects are for him not actual occasions, but they are effective. In other words, even if they are not actual entities, they play a role in the constitution of new actual occasions, which only bolsters the position that these eternal objects are not mere products of thought, but are objective to thought. Now, Abstractions, example, mathematical abstractions, scientific abstractions, abstractions can do nothing. Abstractions are the result of what Thomas Aquinas would call the agent intellect illuminating the phantasm or the imagination and extracting therefrom the intelligible species. So, they are more the product of an active abstracting intellect. But in Whitehead's philosophy, these eternal objects are effective in the sense that they play a role in the constitution of new eternal objects. It then follows that eternal objects are not the abstractions of Aristotle. Now, in what way, therefore, are we to assert the objectivity of eternal objects while denying that they are actual occasions without falling into contradiction? On the one hand, we say they are not actual entities, they are not actual occasions. But on the other hand, we insist, but they are not abstractions in the sense that Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas thought of abstractions, because abstractions of themselves are ineffective. Of course, they are useful to the mind, but of themselves they are ineffective. But eternal objects actually enter into the constitution of actual entities and are therefore effective. So, what kind of objectivity do eternal objects enjoy? Well, their objectivity consists in their envisagement by God. They are objective not because they are part of the objective world. They are objective because they are envisaged by God. They are conceptually prehended by God, and they constitute, this envisagement is what constitutes the divine primordial nature. Very importantly, Whitehead emphasizes that God's relation to these eternal objects is prior to and presupposed by all other entities. If you understand the point we've been making so far, that in the becoming of every actual occasion, the actual occasion prehends occasions and entities in its immediate past as well as eternal objects in order to account for novelty, then God's relationship to these eternal objects must be the presupposition for the becoming of new actual occasions. And that is why we say God's relation to eternal objects is prior to and presupposed by all other entities. A new entity could never become, unless God first prehended all eternal objects, because a new actual occasion always prehends one or the other of these eternal objects, whereby it becomes something new and not a mere repetition of the past. Now, In a past lesson, I also said the eternal objects are ordered. So a human fetus will never develop into a kangaroo. And a leaf cell will never become a human brain cell. That means that the fetal development of a human fetus involves the prehension of ordered eternal objects, such that becoming a kangaroo is not one of the possibilities that the human fetus will realize. Similarly, the leaf cell prehends possibilities, eternal objects that are so ordered so that it becomes impossible for a leaf cell to develop into a brain cell. Now, the ordering of these eternal objects, that we attribute to God. So, God does not only envisage eternal objects, God also orders, places order, establishes order among these eternal objects in such a way as to allow them to be realized, apprehended by actual occasions towards the fuller attainment of value. Now, you might think, but I'm contradicting myself. A while ago, I asserted that the dynamism of the universe, the dynamism of all things, the ongoingness of all things, is neutral as to good or bad, pleasurable or non-pleasurable, pleasurable or painful, beautiful or ugly. And yet, I'm now talking about the optimization of value. Well, yes, the ongoingness does tend towards the optimization of value. And we say, as we said before, that this is because of the initial aim given it by God. The initial aim of all becoming is an aim towards the optimization of value. But despite the initial aim, every actual occasion still realizes its subjective aim. See? So, there is an initial aim provided for by God to all of creativity, but each actual occasion pursues its own subjective aim, starting from, begun by the initial aim derived from the divine being, from God. And of course, in the process of pursuing its subjective aim, like in the case of us, human beings, we can make stupid choices, sinful choices. In the case of cells, cells can mutate, cells can morph in such a way that instead of becoming healthy cells, contributing to the overall health and well-being of the organism, they become cancerous and detrimental. Okay. The ordering of eternal objects in relation to the new occasion is necessary for them to aim at a value compatible with the order of the universe, but with the realization of novelty. Two things. When an actual occasion becomes, its becoming must be compatible with the order of the universe. And this would not happen if the fertilized egg of a dog could develop into a horse, or into a tree, or into a blade of grass. In that case, the order of the universe would really go awry. On the other hand, the universe is not only repetition of the past, the universe is also novelty. So the ordering of eternal objects achieves these two things. The eternal objects that can be actualized by a new occasion are ordered in such wise that the order of the universe is maintained, such as one species does not become another species, and at the same time, novelty is introduced into the universe. You know, I've always said that one common Filipino custom is for visitors to a family that has a new child to remark how handsome the child is or how beautiful the daughter is, and to say, "Kamukhang kamukha mo." And of course, the parents are flattered, but from a philosophical perspective, that would be bad, because that would mean that no element of novelty has entered into the universe at all. Evolution is such that the next step is supposed to be better than the preceding step. Now, if the next step is merely a repetition of the preceding step, then there is no progress at all. So I repeat, the eternal objects are ordered by God. So God does not merely present to new actual or to becoming actual occasions a buffet of eternal objects from which they may choose. No, the eternal objects are ordered so that the order, the harmony, the symmetry of the universe is maintained, and at the same time, novelty enters the universe. Okay, thus far, we have talked only about the primordial nature of God. The primordial nature of God is what provides an initial aim. The primordial nature and therefore gives creativity its initial direction. The primordial nature of God is what envisages eternal objects. The primordial nature of God is what orders eternal objects in such a way that we are allowed to speak of an order in the universe, of harmony in the universe, of sense, of reason, of logos in the universe. Now, about the consequent nature of God. Some Whiteheadian commentators are of the belief that the consequent nature of God is something like an afterthought on the part of Whitehead, that he included it later on only to complete the picture. I don't subscribe to that view, because if every actual occasion prehends past occasions, if every actual occasion is social in the sense that it is related to other actual occasions, then it cannot be the case that God is exempted from this metaphysical principle, because that would violate a fundamental rule, a fundamental tenet of Whiteheadian metaphysics, that God should be an exemplary of all metaphysical principles rather than an exception to them to save a metaphysical system from collapse. So, if other actual occasions prehend, why should God not prehend? And so, the consequent nature of God is not an add-on. The consequent nature of God is a metaphysical necessity. Now, there are very beautiful statements on God's consequent nature. For example, in Religion in the Making, we have this statement: God is the ideal companion who transmutes what has been lost into a living fact within his own nature. So things happen in the universe. Things happen in the universe. Beings come and go. Now, everything that comes to pass, everything that happens, is prehended by God. The first consequence, of course, is that we have to abandon this notion of an immutable God, a God who does not change. Because a God who prehends all that happens in the universe is a mutable God. But why in the first place should we be so sentimentally attached to the idea of immutability? The idea of immutability was something Aristotle and of course Aquinas insisted on, because for them and in their systems, mutability, changeability, was an indication of ontological weakness. The closer to matter, the more mutable. The farther away from matter, the less mutable, the more immutable. But I would rather have a God who is affected by what happens to me and what happens to the universe than a God who is not affected by them at all. In fact, this concept of immutability has caused tremendous problems. For example, if in scriptures we are given the notion that God can be moved by our prayers, that persistence in prayer makes a difference, how can prayers move God if we are dealing with an immutable God? If we are dealing with a God who absolutely cannot change. So as long as the change does not result in God being any less God, but the change results in greater sympathy, in the sense that God sympathizes with more that happens and takes place in the universe, then I would love and adore such a God, rather than one forever fixed, eternally immutable, and unchanging. For example, before the floods hit Tugigaraw and other towns of Cagayan, God could not have prehended these because they did not yet occur. But after they had occurred and they had devastated the lives of so many people, the flood itself and the anguish of the people who suffered have from that time on become part of God's consequent nature. They have been prehended by God. So there is a very real sense in the thought that nothing is ever lost in God. If occasions are successive, because occasions do not occur at the same time, then that can only mean that in God there is also a succession of feeling. So what difference is there between the ordinary actual occasion and God? The prehension of an ordinary actual occasion can only be partial and incomplete. God's prehension is always perfect. God's prehension is always complete. God prehends temporal occasions in such a way as to objectify them with a completeness lacking in the prehensions that take place in the temporal world. Okay, let's say I have a friend, and years later, because of circumstances and divergent paths that we take, I must part from my friend. Question: will my memory of my friend be complete? Will my memory of my friend be permanent? And the answer to both questions is no. My memory of my friend will be imperfect. My memory of my friend will be incomplete. By contrast, if nothing is lost in the prehension of God, God's memory of me and my influence on the divine existence will be perfect and will be complete. In this regard, let's go back to something we took when we were starting this course, the notion of datum and the notion of subjective form. Example: the teacher is a datum for his pupil. And what that means is that the pupil's prehension of his teacher, which will include the memory he has of his teacher, the degree to which his own personality and conduct are influenced by those of his teacher, his remembrance of the things his teacher taught him, will be partial. And that is why we talked of subjective form. We said the teacher will never be transferred to the student completely. Rather, the student will make the teacher a part of himself according to a subjective form, according to the student's own form. However, in God, the objectification is complete, and this completeness will be lacking for nothing. And since there is no perishing in God, every achievement of value will be in God forever. You know, my dear colleagues, my dear fellow philosophy professors, students, brother priests, this is a very consoling thought for me, especially just after having lost my father. If in God nothing is lost, if God's prehension is perfect and complete, that means that it is correct to say that my father, as well as all our departed loved ones, continue to live on in God. In a very real sense. In a very real sense. That is why process philosophers say the consequent nature of God is God's physical pole. Physical pole. Because here he actually takes them into himself. They become part of the divine consequent nature. Not only a memory of them, not only a shadow of my father, not only the thoughts of my father, as happens with me and with the members of his family, but my father as such is, continues to live on in the divine consequent nature. One of the problems our world is facing, and the world constantly faces, is the problem of meaninglessness. Why meaninglessness? Well, if no matter how ardent and how passionate and how sincere our love for others might be, if this love ends in the nothingness of death, in total annihilation in death, what did I love for? What sense is there in the love I had for my father, or in the love my father had for me, if all of this is ultimately to disappear in death? But if we understand Whitehead's concept of the divine consequent nature, then my Father continues to live on in God as part of God's consequent nature, such that I can even say that my Father's existence has enriched the divine consequent nature, because it was not part of the consequent nature of God before my Father existed. And in such a way that I too will enrich the divine consequent nature when my time will be done, or even now. God is prehending me. Now, what about evil, painful, destructive, malevolent events? Are they also prehended by God? Yes. Yes. But remember, they are prehended by a God who lures all of creation to what is best, noblest, most excellent, most kind. And therefore, we are not only realities in the world, actualities in the world, are not only prehended by the divine consequent nature, they are also transformed by the divine consequent nature. Apart from this, if the consequent nature of God were not real, says Whitehead, then human life would only be a flash of occasional enjoyments, lighting up a mass of pain and misery, a bagatelle of transient experience. But thanks to God's consequent nature, we can speak of an eternity, not only of God, but also of ourselves and all that has meaning and worth to us. I shall soon upload another section of this course. Thank you very much for listening.